Greetings. Welcome to this webinar on monitoring college and career ready IEP goal progress. This is an overview webinar that will go along with our other resources on college and career ready IEPs on our CCR IEP webpage. Today, our speakers for the webinar are Barb Novak, literacy consultant on the literacy and mathematics team. Myself, Daniel Parker, I'm one of the assistant directors of special education on the special education team. Tim Pierenboom, our school psychology consultant on the Student Services Prevention and Wellness team. Michaela Smith, who is joining us as a guest speaker and a teacher in the field. And Paula Volpiansky, a technical writer on the special education team. Our learning objectives today are to develop IEP goals that can be reasonably monitored, as well as identifying procedures for measuring progress appropriate to the target skills and behaviors identified in the IEP goals. And we want to understand the role of IEP goal progress data in step 5, analyze progress of the CCR IEP process. By the end of the session, we hope to increase your awareness of how to approach planning for monitoring progress toward IEP goal attainment. The webinar is intended to help you stretch your understanding and potentially think differently about the IDEA requirements related to this topic. We'll be providing you with an overview of the guidelines to consider when planning for and documenting how progress will be monitored.
Great. Hi, this is Paula Volpiansky. Progress monitoring is a really complex topic, and we're only going to scratch the surface today. This session today was developed to provide a big picture overview of monitoring IEP goal progress. It's the first, as Daniel mentioned, of a series of learning resources on this topic. It is not intended to provide a deep dive into the specifics of progress monitoring. Subsequent dig deeper learning modules will be developed to address more specific topics around conducting progress monitoring and using progress monitoring data. We know that some of the terminology that we're using today are used in other contexts. We have found that sometimes when folks hear that we're talking about progress monitoring, there's a tendency to jump immediately to thinking about the specific learning disability rule. We want to reinforce that our use of the terms monitoring progress or progress monitoring during our presentation today is limited to the monitoring of IEP goal progress. While progress monitoring methods and tools for making formal response to intervention decisions, such as the ones that are required for initial SLD eligibility, while these tools can be used to monitor IEP goal progress, especially around reading, decoding, and fluency, it is the department's position that the rules for using progress data to determine eligibility for SLD are not required nor necessarily appropriate for monitoring progress of all IEP goals. Data collection for monitoring IEP goals progress is not the same as assessment for eligibility. That said, we still expect that monitoring of IEP goal progress be systematic and rigorous. Enough said about SLD for the day. The rest of this presentation will focus in only on monitoring IEP goal progress. Let's move to our legal requirements related to monitoring progress, as well as some linkages to our CCI initiatives. So we are grounding ourselves in the CCR IEP 5-step process. We're assuming that most of you are familiar with the content of CCR IEPs and terminology. You can find more information about this on the DPI website. There's also a little icon, and I'm circling it with my cursor right now, and some of the other slides have those icons as well. Whenever you see one, you'll know that that's a direct link to the information. Our handout slide that's in your folder has live links like this, so they'll work for you. Progress monitoring is important to all steps of the process. But planning, deciding, and documenting how progress will be measured and reported, as well as the use of progress data during IEP review and revision, are specific parts of 3 of the steps. Step 3, which is goals, and step 5, which is analyze progress. But by and large, the actual act of monitoring progress occurs outside of IEP development and review. Data from ongoing progress is collected during the student's school day, while the student is engaged in instruction or other activities. So some requirements. Even though there are no specific regulations for progress monitoring procedures in IDEA, progress monitoring is required. Every IEP must include a description of how progress toward meeting the goals will be measured and when periodic reports of student progress will be provided to parents. These two requirements are documented on two DPI sample forms, I-4, the two requirements are documented on a number of DPI forms. DPI form I-4 in the goals section, and the progress reporting reports are on I-5 and I-6 sample forms. Links to these forms are included in the resource section for you. IEP review is another requirement that uses progress data. At least annually, the IEP team must meet to formally review IEP goal progress and revise the IEP as appropriate in response. During the annual review, the IEP team uses information collected and already reported to the parents during the interim reviews and any other relevant information from other staff, general ed teachers, parents, to decide if IEP goals have been met and if the special education services and supports are effectively meeting student needs. However, if the student is not making sufficient progress upon interim review, ongoing review of progress monitoring, one should not wait for an annual review. Immediate action should be taken, such as adjusting teaching and support strategies, or if more significant changes are needed, such as the type, amount, or frequency of services, an IEP team meeting should be scheduled to review and revise the IEP. To meet its substantive obligation under the law, a school must offer an IEP that is reasonably calculated to enable the child to make progress. A recent court ruling has further prompted a renewed look at the IDEA requirements around progress monitoring. You may have heard of the Andrew F. case. This 2017 Supreme Court ruling emphasizes progress, and as I already mentioned, in the ruling, the court held that in order to meet its substantive obligation to provide a free, appropriate public education to students, the schools must offer an IEP reasonably calculated to enable the child to make progress in light of the child's circumstances. The court also rejected the merely more than minimus, which in real word means trivial, progress standard. Now, although the court didn't determine any one test for deciding what appropriate progress looks like for every child, the court decision means for us that IEP teams must implement policies, procedures, and practices related to measuring progress. We've done this with our updated procedural compliance self-assessment standards, which are used to monitor school districts for IDEA compliance. A couple links on this slide. Both of those links go to the Department of Ed Q&A document on this very important law. I'm going to now hand it over to Barb, who's going to continue.
Thanks, Paul. Before we move on to definitions that are important as we're talking about progress monitoring, just want to remind us that the College and Career Ready IEP process, that 5-step process that Paula reviewed in an earlier slide, is grounded in 5 beliefs. One of those beliefs being high expectations, which is what we just heard about in Andrew F. It is important to keep these beliefs in mind when completing each step of the IEP development process, including analyzing progress. For example, having high expectations leads to developing ambitious and achievable goals, which in turn serve as the basis for monitoring student progress. Likewise, effective progress monitoring is a collective responsibility involving multiple educators, students, and families. Student progress is best realized when special and general educators, as well as students and families, share that collective responsibility for monitoring progress and for using progress data to make instructional decisions. For more information on these 5 beliefs, visit our CCR IEP resources page, There's a handout available, and again, there is an icon in the top right corner of the screen that you can use to directly access more information. Collective responsibility is dependent on engaging families and students. Open two-way communication provides opportunities for families and students to share concerns, answer questions, and provide input during all stages of IEP development, implementation, and review, including planning for and conducting ongoing monitoring of student progress, when making decisions about whether progress is sufficient, and when considering what to do when progress is insufficient. This last bullet is especially important. How do we involve students in monitoring their own progress? There's evidence that when students are involved in monitoring and analyzing their own progress toward achieving IEP goals, they feel more ownership over their learning, are more motivated, and have higher rates of achievement. As we continue today, think about how you might actively engage families and students in progress monitoring. So let's get into the heavier lifting for today, moving from the CCR IEP process into specific information related to monitoring progress. So what does it mean to monitor progress? Monitoring student progress is a process linked to ongoing instructional planning. So it's not an event or a special event. It's something that happens on an ongoing basis. It occurs during the student's school day, and progress is measured over time, not just when progress reports are provided to parents or when the IEP team meets. You will hear us during this webinar and in other resources interchangeably using the terms monitoring progress and progress monitoring. We use the terms interchangeably to refer to systematic and planned methods. So progress monitoring or monitoring progress is an ongoing process. We use these terms to talk about procedures for how progress will be measured, really specific procedures like by whom, where, when, so that the progress monitoring is planned at the time that the IEP goal is developed, so all stakeholders know what to expect. We use these terms we use this data from progress monitoring or monitoring progress to determine whether a student is benefiting from the educational services and supports. And this data is linked to IEP goals, including specially designed instruction, related services, and other supports and strategies used in special and general education settings. You now see a definition from the Wisconsin RTI Center Glossary and a definition from PI 1102. And these are additional information about progress monitoring. And as you review these, really think about how progress monitoring is directly linked to making decisions about the effectiveness of instruction and supports. We're not just collecting this data to comply with the legal requirements that Paula mentioned earlier. We're collecting this data so that we can ensure that students are making progress and make adjustments if they're not making the progress we expect. Our working definition of monitoring progress also fits within our state's vision of an equitable multi-level system of support, which you see on the left, and the use of strategic assessment systems within a multi-level system of support, which is marked with the dark colored arrow on the screen. Strategic use of data is at the core of our state's model for an equitable multi-level system of support. In addition, you can consider our state's strategic assessment system. It's a strategic assessment system is the word we use to think about all of the assessment in which an individual student is involved. Data within this system is already being used for general education student progress monitoring and other purposes in the district. So the IEP team can turn to the school or district's strategic assessment system to consider existing sources of progress data as they're designing progress monitoring procedures specific to the individual student's goals. So you're considering what you're already collecting and how that might be able to be used for progress monitoring. Again, the icons on the slide link to more information about multi-level system of support, and the strategic assessment system. So one final point about definitions. Monitoring progress is not the same as screening, as the purposes are different. The purposes of screening listed on the left. The purpose of screening is to identify or predict the potential for poor outcomes. We use screening to identify students who may be at risk for not meeting general education standards and expectations. Most schools screen students for various risk factors, reading, math achievement, mental health, between 1 and 3 times per year. Students identified as at risk are usually provided with some level of general education intervention. The purpose of monitoring IEP goal progress is to measure growth, which is on the right-hand side of the slide. While both screening and progress monitoring tools should be technically sound and brief, which is shown in the middle of the screen, progress monitoring tools must be able to measure small changes in specific targeted student skills or behaviors related to individual student need. With respect to monitoring IEP goals, the progress data used to make ongoing adjustments to instruction and support is also used to make decisions about whether progress is sufficient and whether IEP services and supports are effective in addressing a student's disability-related needs. While the data uses for monitoring progress does have to be as rigorous as the data used to make eligibility decisions, the data used for progress monitoring, is more rigorous than the data used to make screening decisions. The important point is that the progress monitoring must be specific to the skills or behavior specified in the goal. To summarize, why are we really collecting progress data? Well, of course, we want to comply with state and federal laws, but there are also other reasons. As we've mentioned, we are collecting data to guide instructional decision-making. This data can motivate student learning by helping them see progress, and the data helps ensure our collective responsibility by ensuring that all involved stakeholders have input into planning for progress monitoring, are sharing data, know the effects of their effort, and are collaborating when making important decisions. And progress monitoring is a way to advance equity. Monitoring progress will help us reflect on student achievement in relation to ambitious and achievable goals, with the desired outcome being access, engagement, and progress in general education instruction, activities, and environments for all students with IEPs. So before we continue, let's just take a moment to acknowledge that this is a big ask. We each already have a lot of professional responsibilities and demands. And this idea of kind of amping up our progress monitoring may at this point feel like just another thing. But we actually want to help you think about it as a way to use careful planning early in the IEP process to actually remove barriers that make progress monitoring much more seamless by incorporating activities into regular instructional plans and student and teacher schedules. This will help us ensure that everybody has the data that's readily available for those reports that we're sharing with families. And this careful planning helps us work together to get better at progress monitoring by having adequate and reliable data. It also, this adequate and reliable data also supports us in making wiser use of our collaboration and planning time. So putting the work in at the front end should actually increase our efficiency and effectiveness. Focusing more deliberately on the relationship between instruction and the development of skills needed for school achievement is necessary if we want to meet the student achievement need.
This is Paula again. Now that we've provided you with some context, let's turn to some of the prerequisites necessary to effectively plan for using systematic and planned methods for measuring student progress from baseline towards the level of attainment specified in a student's goal. Tim and I are going to go over these 3 key planning considerations on the following slides. First of all, we're assuming that most of you are familiar with these components of the IEP goal page. They are not new. The graphic shows the components of an IEP goal and how they're aligned. Every annual IEP goal incorporates progress monitoring. The terminology that you use in your goal determines the kind of data you're going to collect and what methods will be appropriate for collecting data. We're going to walk through and unpack that a little bit today. So just a quick reminder, this is a restatement of what we have been saying in a little bit more user-friendly words. IEP goal is what you want the student to do and how well. The procedures for measuring progress are how you are going to know how well the student is doing at any given time. And it'll also let you know when the student has met the goal. Again, the main idea here is the foundation for progress monitoring is found within the IEP goal. So now on to the 3 keys that we want to talk to you about today. The first essential key for planning effective progress monitoring is the goal statement must have a measurable target, skill, and behavior. And the target, skill, and behavior must address a student-specific disability-related need based on an analysis of effect and root causes aimed at improving the student's access, engagement, and progress in general education. So if you're familiar with the CCR IEP process, this is really all about steps 1 and 2. And then moving that into your goal statement. As we present each key, I just want to let you know that we're going to show you some examples, and then we're also going to give you some opportunities to check your understanding. And so these are some things you need to master before you can really monitor progress. The term measurable in here is also critical. What is measurable? Well, according to the Oxford Dictionary, it's something that can be quantified, i.e., you have to be able to count it. Shorthand is if you can observe it or hear it, you can count it. During our CCR IEP Step 2 training, we provide guidance on the required discussion needed to develop a measurable annual goal that addresses the need. I want to go over that guidance as a refresher to thinking about how identifying a measurable target skill, which really is at the heart of the IEP goal. The sentence stems on this slide have been provided to help us think about the relationship between the effects of disability, root causes, and disability-related needs. And again, we're going to show you some examples. So our sentence stem for how we think about this is the student does X, Y, or Z. These are the things that we can see because of certain root causes, and the root causes are the things that are about the nature of the student's disability. The disability-related need then goes to say that the student needs to develop or increase an area, a skill, a behavior, which relates to the root causes that are inherently related to that child's disability-related need. So the student can Y. In other words, Y is the effect. So the student can better access, engage, or make progress in general education, instruction activities, etc. And the result of this is that we expect the outcomes will improve. And outcomes, those are the things that we check. The student will better meet the standards and expectations that apply to all kids. So that's kind of the thinking of how these things connect. By connecting IEP goals to the disability-related need, the IEP team ensures that each IEP goal targets and root causes of why the student is not meeting early learning or grade level standards and expectations. Focusing on observed effects and root causes should also help you limit the number of IEP goals to those that really need to be addressed to address a student's individual disability-related needs. One assumption is that if we can address the root cause, we will improve the student's access, engagement, and progress in general education. And I know we repeat that a lot, but it's an important concept to understand. So before we show you some examples of parts of goal statements, we want to show you a summary of one IEP team's analysis of effects and root causes so that you can see how the IEP team arrived at the target for the goal. This analysis is a product of steps 1 and 2 of the CCR IEP process. Also, this example is a modification of the example that has been often used in CCR IEP training for the past couple of years, and you may have participated in that. In this example, we can see how the team analyzed why the student does not read grade level materials independently. That is the observed effect. The student is not reading grade level materials independently. So we can see how the team analyzed why this is happening. And this also relates to why the student is not meeting some of the grade level standards. By asking why the student was not independently reading grade level, the team identified 2 disability-related needs. Those are improving decoding skills, and they did get enough data that they identified some sub-skills, segmentation and morphology. And also another need was to develop new strategies to reduce frustration and improve engagement in reading activities and independently accessing text. So this slide has some examples of possible goal statements linked directly to the needs. I do want to say these are partial goals, not the entire goal. It doesn't show the baseline or expected level of attainment yet, only the target behaviors specifically tied to the root causes. We will add the baseline and level of attainment later, but the most important part is actually identifying a target skill that we can measure, a measurable target. So the first goal to increase reading fluency is based on the student's need to improve decoding skills so they can read grade level materials more fluently independently. That's the effect. It's not surprising that not being able to read grade level materials with sufficient fluency creates barriers for this student to access engagement and progress in general education. So the IEP team decided that a second goal was needed. The second goal statement targets the student's need to develop strategies to help that student more effectively engage and participate in academic learning that requires reading. We would assume that this latter goal statement might need to include objectives or benchmarks, or at the least specify a list of strategies that we know the student is going to be taught and will help them. We do have some behavior examples in our resource slides at the end, and Michaela's example that she will share with you also has some behavior focus as well. And I'm going to hand it over to Daniel. We're going to do a quick check-in with you.
All right, so we are going to be asking you which of these are measurable target behavior skills, and I'm going to pop up a quiz on your screen for each of these questions, and these are the questions. And Paula is going to lead you through some of our thinking on this.
All right, so here's what we thought as we played around with these, and the question really just is, can you measure this target skill? Is this a potential target skill relating to a disability-related need that could be measured? So the first one, improving reading fluency by increasing decoding accuracy and rate. The answer we came up to this was yes, this could be a measurable target skill for a goal. And the answer is, excuse me, since reading fluency is a multi-factored skill, we felt it would be important to add what specific skill related to the disability-related need the student would demonstrate to show improved reading. And in this example, you could be measuring reading fluency by measuring decoding accuracy and rate. Both skills would need to be measured to determine that the student had improved their fluency. The second one, show respect for school property. The answer is no, because respect is not something you can hear or see, so you can't measure respect. If this is what the team came up with during a meeting, one might decide to go back and ask some more why questions and explore the effect a little bit more specifically to get a better understanding of what does it mean to show respect for school property and to operationalize that into what the student might be doing. And in turn to then focus in on, so why do we think the student is doing those things that to us mean not showing respect for school property? Increased time on task during independent seat work is something we believe that could be measurable. And in this example, the target skills actually tells you when you want to see and measure it. It's during independent seat work. So that gives you some more information about when you want to measure seeing that student doing their seat work. Using math strategies, we said yes, but we also agreed that this statement could be improved by including some examples of math strategies that you would be expecting the student to use. And I know that is a challenge to how then would you see that the student is using math strategies. And obviously that would be something the team would need to think about if this is the target that they chose to use. And the last one, we said no. Meeting grade level standards, we said, is not a reasonable target for a goal. It is a broad expectation for all students, not necessarily based on the analysis of effects and root causes for an individual student about any particular area. There are a very large number of sub-skills one would need to measure to determine if a student is meeting grade level standards. So as stated, just stating that the student will meet grade level standards cannot be efficiently monitored. How would you measure ongoing progress towards meeting all of, for example, the reading standards for a student? So you would want to narrow that down to specific things related to that student's needs. I'm going to hand over the slides to Tim, who will go over keys number 2 and 3.
So the second key consideration in planning for monitoring IEP goal progress is about what we are measuring. And this relates to how the goal is written. We need to know these things before we provide instruction and supports to address the student's needs. We must have a clear baseline and a clear level of attainment for the end of the IEP duration, typically 1 year. So if I were to ask you to run a race, you certainly would want to know where the starting and finish lines are. The level of attainment should be ambitious and achievable in light of a student's circumstances. Remember, that was from the Emptor decision. The measures we use for the baseline and level of attainment must be the same. So we want to make sure that we're able to compare apples to apples rather than apples to oranges. The methods used to measure should be appropriate to the goal rather than having the measures determine what we're going to write for a goal. So we don't want to put the cart before the horse here. But as you consider these types of progress monitoring already being done in the school, avoid the temptation to write a goal based on what is easy to monitor or on progress monitoring tools that happen to be available or easy to use. Always start with the student's disability-related needs. How you write your goal, including the type and unit of measure used for baseline and level of attainment, defines how you will monitor and report progress. There are often several appropriate ways to measure a particular target behavior. The wording of each of your goals should include enough detail to allow those implementing the IEP to know what skills are being targeted and determine when the student has met the goal. Additionally, the wording of the goal must provide clear guidance for measuring interim progress from baseline towards goal attainment. This is necessary for educators to use the progress data to make timely instructional adjustments, as well as regularly providing parents with progress reports. Finally, what you measure must be able to stand in for the target behavior. That is, your measure must be valid for measuring change in the target. It's usually not enough to only measure the effect, such as assignment completion or remaining in class. In this example, the student's disability-related needs are reading fluency and decoding. Reading speed and reading and decoding accuracy of a fourth grade reading level, of text at a fourth grade reading level, are the skills that will be measured to indicate or stand in for improved fluency and decoding. This behavior example is a little more complicated. Here, multiple types of data may need to be collected to monitor progress related to the disability-related need of improving anxiety and frustration management. The team that created this goal wanted to measure the effect of the disability that led to the identification of these disability-related needs, time engaged in instruction in this case. But the team was also aware that the root causes needed to be directly targeted. To do this, the team developed several benchmarks or objectives that build toward the overall goal of improving anxiety and frustration management skills. Those benchmarks or objectives were accurate identification of triggers, selecting and demonstrating strategies during simulation exercises, then using those strategies in natural environments to remain engaged or re-engage in general education classroom activities with fated prompts. Much of the progress data related to this goal will be able to be collected during regularly scheduled, specially designed instruction and in general education settings with relatively simple observation or checklist procedures.
All right. This is another opportunity for you to weigh in. We're going to pop up another quiz, and I'm going to leave this on for a little bit. I want you to really look at this statement. So here's the goal statement with the level of attainment, and you need to be thinking, what will you be progress monitoring? So there's something in this statement that you will be progress monitoring, and we're going to show you some choices here in a second. So when the student, if the level of attainment in the goal statement says the student will improve reading comprehension as demonstrated by, after reading a 5th grade level passage, identifying the main idea and answering 10 recall questions with 90% accuracy on 5 consecutive trials, which of these are you going to be monitoring? Go ahead and fill it in. Are you going to be monitoring reading comprehension, identifying main idea, reading 5th grade text fluently, answering recall questions, E, A, and C, B, and D, or all of the above?
So the answer B and D. In this example, the area of disability-related need is reading comprehension. But because reading comprehension is relatively complex and fairly general, that to meaningfully measure interim growth in reading comprehension, that's going to involve breaking the skill down into observable, measurable behaviors. So for this student, identifying main idea and answering recall questions is how improved reading comprehension will be demonstrated. So these two skills need to be measured to show growth in reading comprehension. The assumption here is that the IEP team identified these particular reading comprehension skills to target during the root cause analysis because these skills significantly affected this student's reading comprehension. So again, what you're measuring is going to represent or stand in for the target.
So I noticed a question popped up as to would it make sense to divide this into objectives? And the answer is sure, you could do that. And again, they would make sense if you wanted to make one goal, improving reading comprehension, and make that into 2 objectives. You could certainly do that.
So moving on to key number 3. Now that we have our goal statement that includes a baseline and level of attainment, our final consideration is going to be how we go about measuring progress. We recognize that this key is one that we'll need to provide more detail on in future modules. For today, we'll just briefly describe the key details on the next couple of slides. The first part of this key is planning. This slide outlines a general process to guide teams in the development of procedures to monitor IEP goals. IEP teams should consider these 6 steps when planning for progress monitoring. Remember, putting some time into the first 3 steps can improve the ease and efficiency of completing the last 3 steps. Step 1, verifying the target behaviors. That is, being sure that each team member is clear on the targeted skills. Step 2, making sure you match the method to the target to ensure you're actually measuring change in the targeted skill. Step 3, determining progress monitoring schedule and data collection details. It's important that the educators asked to collect progress data be able to deliberately plan for this important responsibility. Additionally, educators responsible for measuring student progress should be able to schedule data review time in their weekly calendar. Teams should consider providing a brief summary of how often progress data will be collected and the environments in which data will be collected on the IEP form. So steps 1 to 3 occur during the development of the IEP. Steps 4 through 6 are going to occur during the actual implementation of the IEP. As a starting point, you might want to try using these process steps to self-assess your current local progress monitoring practices. During the planning process, IEP teams are going to determine the tools and procedures that will be used to monitor progress. On this slide is a summary of characteristics of effective procedures and tools. Anything used to monitor IEP goal progress should be accurate. That's to be sure you're assessing the right thing over time. Sensitive to small changes in performance. This is important in order to make timely adjustments to instruction if there's a lack of progress. Frequent, and the frequency here will depend on what the target skill is and what's being measured. And simple and brief. You don't want to take away too much time from instruction. We encourage you to try this list as a checklist for reviewing IEP goals and descriptions of how progress is measured in some of your current IEPs. We anticipate developing multiple modules addressing the information on these last 2 slides in further depth. For now, we've shared a draft handout with you in the webinar Google folder. Click on the icon at the top of this slide to get the handout. The handout includes proposed checklist items that we'll use to develop for future training resources. Feel free to provide feedback to us using the link on the handout.
All right, so we got another interactive quiz. This time, instead of popping up each question, we are going to have you take a look at these, and I'm going to throw up one poll, and which of these should not be used to monitor IEP goal progress. So you're only going to tell us the ones that are not used.
All right, so I suspect several of you are frustrated that there was not an option to say it depends for a lot of those, because that is truly the correct answer to this trick question. So in terms of a daily behavior checklist, the answer is maybe. It needs to be aligned with the target behaviors in the goal, and you have to meet all those other procedures that we talked about in the previous slide. Annual statewide assessment exam, such as the forward exam, that's a pretty simple no. It's certainly not able to isolate the targeted skills you would have in an IEP. It only assesses general domains, and it's not sensitive to small changes in performance. Unit quizzes is another it depends. It will depend on how often or the frequency that they're given, and if the questions contained in the quiz adequately measure the specific targeted skill for that student. The grade level screeners that are typically administered 1 to 3 times a year, the answer is no. Those are too infrequent. They're not likely to be sensitive to small changes in a target skill on an IEP. That being said, these could be used along with other more sensitive measures. In terms of the writing rubric scores, again, it depends on how often it will be used, if it's frequent enough, if it specifically measures the target skill that's in the goal. I suspect you're all sensing a pattern here. Publish CBM probes as long as the probe measures the targeted skill and is done frequently enough. Often published probes are designed to be used as frequently as once per week, so that would suggest that the frequent expectation would be met. In terms of running records, again, it will depend on the frequency that it's administered, how it aligns with the targeted skill and the goal, and whether the running record is at the reading level identified in the baseline and level of attainment. So all of these answers, I went over a few examples, but one simple test that you could look at to determine the adequacy of progress monitoring is just walk through that previous slide, those things in the previous slide. Determine if it's accurate, if it's sensitive enough, if it's frequent enough, if it's simple and brief. And this one, I just want to go over briefly. Again, we will be working on some future modules to go more in depth in some of these areas to provide some more support for teams and documents. But here are just some methods. Again, we're not going to go into specifics, but these are all things, methods that you could use. There are some that have specific tools, some that do not, but these are just some examples of sample progress monitoring methods.
Okay, so in summary, here are two things that we really want to remind you and say one more time. Now that we've finished with the content for our session, we want to share a real life example with you. But before that, I just want you to keep in mind when you're developing your goals, your IEP teams should really think about how you're going to measure progress to determine the baseline performance and level of attainment. You really need to consider the method of measuring and how you're going to do it along with the target behavior. And also the method of measurement used for the baseline and goal are going to determine the data collection methods that you are going to use for progress monitoring. So these are all things to kind of keep in mind while you are thinking about, gee, we have this disability related need and how we're going to go about constructing a goal to address that. So we're now going to move forward to a real life example, which is very exciting for me. And I'm going to introduce Michaela really quickly. Michaela has been serving as a itinerant teacher for over a decade in the roles of teacher visually impaired, certified orientation mobility specialist, and travel instructor. Her educator experiences range from birth to 3 through adulthood and have expanded into administrative leadership and management. She is a DPI recognized mentor for newly licensed teachers of visually impaired and orientation and mobility. And she is active within a number of statewide professional organizations. Michaela's professional vision is to develop personalized success for all students through the continuous pursuit of collaboration and incorporation of student voice. And after Michaela does her presentation, we're going to go over a number of resources, and there'll be one more survey that we want you to do, so please stick around. Michaela has worked to show us how in real life the process that we've been talking about today might work. And go ahead, Michaela.
Thank you very much, and hello everybody. Today I'm welcoming you to walk along with me through a modified but still true example of how to create collaborative goals with integrated progress monitoring procedures. So here's the story. There's a 5th grade student who has multiple areas of need. And as is often the case with these students, the IEP team is quite large. the student has significant cognitive needs, but the real truth is that the student's limited communication opportunities affected our understanding of their true abilities. So imagine, which I'm sure you can do in those IEP meetings, that you are sitting there and a discussion occurs. There's a common thread that seems to emerge. The parents say that their child is refusing and yells and injures themselves when they're in unfamiliar areas. And then there's other school team members that agree they're seeing these same behaviors quite frequently, and that the behaviors have an effect on the student being able to access and participate in their learning. But as a team, we didn't just stop there and say, hey, let's write a goal that's focused on all these negative behaviors. We wanted to ask why. So in order to find that root cause of the behaviors, we opened it up to the IEP team to make suggestions. The family had started and said they just believed that the student really didn't want to. The OTs and PTs shared that the mobility, maybe the student had a fear of falling. The speech and language pathologists shared that their receptive and expressive communication could be impacting that understanding their ability to travel, where they're traveling to, and then express their needs. The vision and mobility team said there's a lot of fear and anxiety that could be caused because of that limited understanding of the environment. And the 5th grade teacher shared that the student behavior definitely has an impact on the participation. And as the team continued to ask why, the responses seemed to keep leading back to communication and understanding. We then, as a team, could now summarize and prioritize the student's disability-related need, not necessarily one thing versus the other, but together. It was time for a collaborative and multidisciplinary goal. So here's how we dug a little deeper in defining the student's disability-related needs and what we wanted the student to gain, and then the goal that represented it all. We knew that the student's disability-related needs related to being aware of receptive communication modes so that they could understand where they were going and the activity they were going to participate in. The student needed to improve their travel skills so they could increase their instructional time. They needed to increase their regulated behaviors so that those barriers that were affecting their participation in instruction could be reduced. And the student needed support tools just for their physical and safety needs. So here's how our goal read, and here's how it connects. The student will improve receptive communication and travel. Those are our disability-related needs. By responding to cues and increasing distance traveled outside the classroom with fewer refusals, yelling, or self-injurious behavior. Those are those targeted skills that were related to the need, so that the barriers to participations are reduced and the access to their instruction and activities are increased. Those are the effects of the disabilities that we wanted to address. We knew our first step as a team was to start exposing the student to communication strategies. We had decided to use a nonverbal communication cue system that also included visual cues, tactile cue cards, and tactile sign. We were purposeful in our planning and collaboration and started with repetitive travel routines in multiple settings that linked both special ed and general ed. We started with travel between special ed classes to specials like art and music and gym. And from there, we used that baseline information that we had documented and targeted those skills to make sure we had the longest distance of travels and how many behavior stops the student was showing. Behavior stops in this case is what we referred to for our, the yelling or refusals or the self-injurious behavior. Honestly, the student was complex and it was hard to keep that end goal in mind because there were so many barriers. But writing a goal with growth in mind was key to our success. We were really just setting the student up and the team up for success by really digging in this deep. Further breakdown, because that's a lot of language to go through. When we reviewed the goal and identified the target behaviors, this was how we broke down how we and what we needed to measure so that we could tell if the student was making progress towards the goal of improving receptive communication skills and that distance of travel. Next, we defined the progress monitoring procedures that we would use. We knew we could collect the data 3 times per week based on a very individualized chart, which I'll show you soon, by school staff that were supporting these travel routines. The glory of that was almost all of our specialists and IEP team members and staff within the school were able to help that part and help collect the data. Our data was analyzed every 6 weeks and at the end of each trimester. The progress reports were shared with the family 3 times a school year, and that also included the IEP. Since the student's daily performance could be variable, we decided to formally collect data that 3 times per week. The team identified consistent times of the day when the student was scheduled to travel between classes. That was those special times: music, art, gym, cooking. These were all natural and routine part of the days that could be monitored collaboratively. Many of these transitions were already supported by the student's special education staff or those general education staff, and we knew we could get regular data points in order to really show growth. The individualized data chart was included in a binder with the student's materials, and each staff would observe and chart on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays to keep it consistent. As communication skills and travel distances increased, the number and variety of observers increased as well. The whole school became united, and we all knew the goal and documentation system for this student. Here is what our data chart looked like. It was made to be quick, accurate, and used by all staff. That included teachers, any aides, related service, general education teachers, even student teachers. The staff members would circle the responses, strategies, and tools. Locations were written along with the distances. Distances were marked in the hallway to different locations using electrical tape, markers, and by counting floor tiles. Behavior stops were tallied and other notes were documented, which helped keep track of any additional patterns. Whomever was working with this student could easily record the data without much interruption in their regular schedule. The data chart met the characteristics of an effective progress monitoring tool. It accurately measured our targeted behaviors. It was sensitive. It was frequent. It was very simple and could be done very briefly. This is how our final goal looked. It had a goal statement that was clear and stated how the growth would positively affect the student's academic performance. The baseline is quantified and it matches the skills in the goal. The level of attainment is also quantified, is clear, and uses the same measure as the baseline. it is clearly written that the data will be collected 3 times a week and reviewed every 4 to 6 weeks, and that all staff were sharing this role of data collection. We had also decided that the best time to conduct a deeper data dig and report any of our findings would be at that trimester time, because it was a natural time in the school schedule when all student families were receiving information about their students' academic growth. This goal was not just a mobility goal. It was not just a speech or a communication goal. This was a student goal. It addressed the students' disability-related needs across all settings. And everyone who worked with this student, including their parents, shared a collective buy-in for the work. Going into how we decided to write our benchmarks, we had chose to reflect a period of time and documenting the student responses in the distance of travel and the behavior. By doing those benchmarks, reflecting that period of time, this made our reporting on progress clear and accurate. It was manageable due to the simplicity and brevity, and it truly connected to the IEP team decisions. Plus, because the school staff on the IEP team shared the responsibility of collecting the data and regularly reviewing this data, all the staff who had access to our online IEP software could accurately report on the students' progress. Our team reported that there was less professional stress, there was greater clarity on the outcomes that we were working towards, and there was a greater engagement from the student, the family, and the staff because we were united. Our team also utilized a Google form to record and manage the data we had gathered, because we quickly realized that our paper data charting could easily become too cumbersome. The form was able to show us the graphics of the bullets that we have listed above, and the family was shown the graphics at the school conferences, and the details were also attached to the I-6 interim progress report form at the end of the trimester. There is an active link to an example of the Google form that we used on this slide. And all of the items that we have in this bullets were increased engagement and improved communication. So it was a very exciting time for our team. Going further, because the bullets on the last slide weren't exactly how we would document it on our CCR IEP. This is more of the language we used at that time. That the student respond to both tactile sign and tactile communication cues. The highest responses were demonstrated by reaching for a cue and moving towards the classroom exit, showing that they understood where they were heading to next. The average distance that they were traveling within this time period was about 24.5 feet, and the average behavior stops were just under 2, that 1.9. The data reflected a total of 29 data points during the first trimester. The graph that we were able to show the parents showed an increase in distance and that decrease in behavior stops. It was pretty awesome, but this is how we wrote it in on our progress report. After the first trimester, we discussed the scope and sequence of the next steps in a variety of need areas. As a school team, we had decided to reevaluate the data within the first few weeks of the next school year and update students' current skills and identify continuing or possibly new barriers. Our team knew that the students' needs and their goals would evolve over time, and we acknowledged that the collaborative approach that was serving the student and the family and the school was working well at this time. And a fun update about this student is that I'm currently not working with them. They're not on my caseload as an orientation and mobility specialist. But I was able to observe a video of this student just this past week. And this student is currently reaching their classes with very, very rare behavior stops. The team is continuing to use a combination of tactile cues and schedules, the tactile signing, and just consistent language by all staff interacting with them. The adult support is systematically being faded. The signing educational assistant now walks ahead of the student about 5 to 10 feet and gestures the direction of travel need versus needing to really be directly interacting at all times. The student is developing both mobility and vocabulary skills as they continue to come into contact with objects during their travels due to their increased independence. The student is vocalizing more words based on the cues presentation, those tactile cues, and they're beginning to even use those tactile cues to communicate their wants by repetitively touching the cue that is preferred. They're being very persistent. The barriers that had been affecting their participation and access to instruction and their activities seem to be continuously declining. I can't even tell you how excited I was to see that this process is continuing to work. I can share with you that it wasn't always easy, but it was worth it. And for the team that is still working with this student, it continues to be worth it.
All right, thank you, Michaela. That was an excellent example. We really appreciate that. So the big final thoughts here are that monitoring IEP progress is a process, not an event. And the ultimate reason we must make a commitment to this systematically monitor progress is so we can know if the instruction and supports we are providing to students is having the results we're looking for. Access, engagement, and progress in general education, instruction environments, and other activities. Now we're going to go through a few resources and additional content that was included as part of this webinar. One of the things that you might want to do when you're thinking about this in your districts and schools is how you might engage various educators in monitoring IEP goal progress. So depending on the student's needs and the goal, data may be collected in specific or varied environments. The goal identifies the target behavior. Data may be collected whenever the conditions of the goal are met. For example, if the goal is to increase reading fluency of a certain grade level text, then data may be collected whenever the student is orally reading that level text. If the student participates in reading in both general and special education environments, data could be collected in either environment by a general or special educator. Any educator who knows how to collect data related to a goal may collect the data. It does not need to be a particular special educator. So we encourage you to have these types of discussions when thinking about various educators who might monitor IEP goal progress. Another thought is to be thinking about how you might engage students in monitoring their progress toward goal achievement or their level of attainment. So we encourage teams to be thinking about students and one of the students' goals and thinking about how that student might be actively involved in collecting, analyzing, and sharing their own IEP goal data. We're always thinking of ways to involve students more in the IEP progress. Engaging students in monitoring their own progress can be a significant motivator, not to mention potentially a good way to work on applied math and reasoning skills. Students can be taught to tally and chart their own progress. Sitting down with the teacher to review progress regularly can help the students see the progress they are making. And even students with more severe disabilities can be involved in monitoring and reflecting on their own progress. So it's just a matter of how you make that information accessible to the student in the formats that will work best for them. Another further thought is thinking about those in leadership roles. What are those most important things that you can do in a leadership role, or you could do in a district to support the capacity to systemically monitor IEP goal progress, analyze and share progress data, and make instructional and IEP decisions in response to measurement of student progress? So really be thinking about those different ways. You know, how do your teams have the tool, knowledge, skills, or tools to do this properly? Do you need IEP software systems that can help this, or do you have something that's already working? How are teachers trained in that? How do you balance efficiency, monitoring progress, progress reporting, collaboration planning with teaching and learning? So there's a dance here. You want to make sure that we're actually getting time spent in teaching and learning, but having really efficient ways for monitoring and thinking about the data that we collect. And are your teams putting the cart before the horse? Are they spending a lot of time developing goals based on anecdotal or weak data, and then deciding the method of measuring progress and when it will be reported to parents? Don't get caught in an Andrew F. situation. You know, progress monitoring is not an afterthought. You'd want your doctor to know if a medication was not working before or early on during treatment before symptoms got worse, wouldn't you? So the same thing can apply to education. We want to make sure that what we're putting together has a plan for working. So this slide is a behavior example that we did not include in the original webinar, but it's just another supplementary example to go along with the resources as part of this webinar. In this example, we can see how the team analyzed one of the effects of the student's disability that results in the student leaving or being removed from class. Removals for behavior reasons is one of the most common reasons students miss instruction. For a student with a disability, even short removals can affect academic progress and social-emotional development. In this example, the IEP team identified that the behaviors that most often resulted in the student wanting to leave class or being removed most often occurred when the student became overwhelmed by stimulation and in certain settings. When academic or behavior demands were added to this, the student became even less able to access and engage in activities in that general education environment. So the IEP team determined the student needed to develop better skills to manage their awareness of and response to the types of stimulation they regularly encounter in general education. One would also assume that in addition to directly working on the student's skill, the student's IEP would also identify or specify supports in the classroom to reduce social and emotional needs, as well as environmental barriers to access and engagement. Here's an example of a goal statement for this same student in the previous example. This goal statement only identifies the target behavior to improve anxiety and frustration management strategies and the related objectives. It is not a complete goal because it does not include a baseline or level of attainment data. That will come later. First, we need to make sure we have a target behavior or skills that directly relates to the disability-related need and that can be measured. In this example, the team decided objectives were needed to operationalize improving anxiety and frustration management. The team that developed this goal knew that it was not enough just to measure increased time engaged in classroom instruction. They also wanted to make a clear link between the root cause and the related disability-related need, which is difficulty with anxiety and frustration management due to trouble accurately identifying triggers and developing and using management strategies, and the effect, which is removal from classroom activities. You can see that the goal is stated in positive terms of what the student will do versus what the student won't do. So one of the pieces around this is just really making sure that when we develop goals, we're developing the goal around a skill that we are going to improve and increase. It's sometimes not enough just to measure the effect of the disability or the behavior output. You certainly want to keep track of that and have that information. It may show up as an additional measure, or it might be something that you refer to in your present level. But we always suggest developing good goals is going to be around a skill that is going to be increased in that student. All right. So this is just another follow-up activity that school staff can do, or with their district and school staff once you are kind of thinking through how you want to utilize these processes. So take a look at your IEP goals in your current IEPs. You could do this around a staff training or a meeting or a group of teacher teams working across grade level. And for each goal, ask yourself, if we follow the procedures for measuring the student's progress toward meeting the annual goal as written, will we know if the student has made sufficient progress and be able to report the degree of progress during each reporting period? If we were to develop this IEP again, how might we revise the goal statement or stated progress measurement procedures to more effectively monitor ongoing progress toward IEP goal attainment? Of course, before you would change the IEP, you would make sure to have an IEP meeting to revise that IEP with all members, including the parent, available. So try using these checklists to reflect on your current IEPs and when drafting future IEP goals and progress monitoring procedures. We want to get into some additional resources at this point. There are so many rich resources on our CCR IEP Learning Resources page. There are additional resources on screening and progress monitoring from the Wisconsin RTI Center. There's some great national resources from the National Center for Response to Intervention on their progress monitoring page, as well as the Iowa Department of Education has some progress monitoring procedures that we think you should check out. Other national resources can be found from the National Center on Intensive Interventions. Wisconsin's Framework for an Equitable Multi-Systems of Supports is another Wisconsin resource that really lays out, if you're going to do anything like implement a system for progress monitoring, those key systems features that are part of an equitable multi-level system of support can be extremely useful in thinking through all the pieces that need to be in place to implement an effective system. We strongly recommend also looking at the culture responsive practices work that we have here through the department and the Wisconsin Strategic Assessment Systems for additional resources and information. If you want to look at some information on the DPI forms page on our sample forms, there's some links on this page that really give you some specific guidance related to the I-4 linking form, as well as the interim review of IEP goals, which is the I-6, and the annual review of IEP goals, I-5. So in our forms, sample forms guide, there's specific additional directions. On this slide are links to a number of related DPI initiatives aimed at these intents. When you click on each picture, it will take you to the web page for that initiative. So thank you again. Thank you to our speakers. Special thank you to everyone who's taken part in the live and recorded webinar. Take care.